break. You ready to go? Very good. Well, similar to what you just saw, we will, Gerard and I will tag team this as we go through, so back and forth. We had our media briefing in this room this afternoon, and kind of tie into some of Dr. Casey's commentary to open, because I think it's relevant to just sort of set the stage, maybe even more so than some of the expenditure choices that we're going to walk you through. I think the process and this year and the and the backdrop are vitally important. I don't think I'm, telling you anything you don't know in terms of the amount of economic uncertainty that's floating around out there. If you pick up a newspaper or watch the news, any financial website, you'll see, and we'll give you a flavor of that. But I think, and Bob did a good job highlighting the process on their side, but the challenge for us is we have to have this thing in place by May 1. Effectively, we've got to have it done by April 9. You're voting on this by that date. So we've got a little over a month to make all of these decisions, and certainly we will not have all of the economic variables that we are monitoring. We will not have answers on those. All the direction will not be established. So I say all that because we have built this budget with an increased number of safeguards to make sure that between April 9th of this year and June 30 of next year, that we have enough flexibility in the plan to be able to pivot to whatever might come down the line. I think that's just vitally important. So what you're going to see as we go throughout the presentation today is a greatly reduced number of expenditure that have been included in the budget. You're going to see a revenue forecast that is subdued as compared to previous years. There are a number of top line priority items that we are recommending to continue to move forward, but doing so in a very, very measured way. So and then at the same time recognizing, as we said this morning in the media briefing, this economic uncertainty is not uniquely experienced by Chesterfield County government. It's by all of our residents and businesses, and so there is a continued emphasis on tax relief and making sure that we are making progress on these longstanding initiatives, but doing so in a way that recognizes that we are all in this together, and we need to factor that reality into the plan. So, Gerard, you want to get started?
Yeah. So the first thing we like to talk about when we look at the economic plan and situation is just the labour market. It's really the engine of the entire economy, and there's enough numbers in front of you in those documents. I'm not going to rattle off a whole bunch of statistics today, but just more of the kind of overall trend. We'll talk about what's happened over the last few weeks as we get further into this deck. But prior to that, there was a general slowdown in the economy as a whole. I'm not sitting here saying that a recession was coming, but there was definitely a slowing down. You can see that in the number of job openings, the chart to the left. You can see it in terms of that step down from 22, 23, 24. You can have 300,000 the average jobs per month added, down to 200, now down to the kind of mid 100 range. So prior to everything that's come in the news in the last few weeks, the economy as a whole was generally beginning to slow down after that kind of aberrational period from the COVID impact.
Same, again, the numbers aren't important. Really, the shape of these charts. Housing starts, you see sort of that turn back in 2022. So again, it's a bit of a perfect storm. You got a sort of a natural cycle of the economy occurring, and then you've got sort of this uncertain policy environment that we have waded into over the course of the last 60 days. Those two factors, bumping into each other is a challenging backdrop to build any budget, but certainly this year. Same idea here. You see household debt starting to trend back up. On the left-hand side, you see COVID. A lot of the resources during that period of time went to paying down household debt, and you saw a very strong consumer, and they've been able to use some of that capacity to fuel the economy over the last couple of years, but that's getting back up there into those levels, which is a concern. And then you see on the right-hand side sort of federal interest payments skyrocketing up into record territory. Delinquency rates on credit cards, you see a couple of different categories there. The top one, the sharpest increase, is the credit card piece. Again, savings starting to run dry a little bit, starting to put more spending on the credit card at the consumer level, and this is what you're looking at here is delinquencies over 90 days, so that's considered to be fairly serious, and you see that ticking back up. And the closest thing that we have to it in modern years is the Great Recession. Not quite to those levels, but again, these are all of the factors that we're monitoring and trying to decipher as we bring you a financial plan for fiscal year 26. Lastly is sort of the look back period. You see inflation. You saw that it stalls, the perfect word here. They're trying to get that down around 2% if you listen to the Fed, if you follow that. And we're making a lot of progress, but it really has kind of stalled out in terms of those declines. So depending on what measure you look at, it's anywhere from 2.5% to 3.5% inflation. And the tariffs in particular that are being discussed now, I think, are going to push this or have the potential to push this back up. So that's another factor that certainly will weigh on not only 26, but perhaps beyond that.
Now I get to be the harbinger of good news. So these are a compilation of articles that we have been looking at over the last month or so. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, we were beginning to see a general slowdown in the economy, but really now the economy is beginning to flash red. This chart, I think, more than any that you will see, kind of shows that. GDP, when it gets released, is always subject to revision, and there's a bit of a lag to it, but the Atlanta Fed produces what they call GDP now. And what it does is it takes the information as it's coming out and feeds it into one of their models to predict what's essentially happening to GDP in real time. It will be subject to revisions, I'm sure, but you can see that steep drop-off that's happened over the last month or so. There's been a slight rebound, but you can see the effects of uncertainty really beginning to weigh, not just on the consumer, but on businesses, and both, just as human nature, like certainty. They do not like unpredictability. So we are very much in a kind of wait-and-see pattern, but you are beginning to see this stuff feed through into the national statistics. You can see that as well on various other measures. You can see what's called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Without getting into the weeds, it basically looks at, what are people looking at online? What are they searching? Terms recession, downturn. You can see that spike that's happened in the last few weeks. The last time that you can see something close to that was during the COVID period. The chart on the right measures, it comes from the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey, measures where people think inflation is going to go. It was already trending higher over the last few years with all the inflation that was feed through the economy, but with the potential looming impact of tariffs and maybe some other measures, you've seen that spike up to its highest level since 1995 within the last few weeks as well.
And again, focusing on the general shape of the charts, not the specific numbers, but the first series of charts, you kind of see that gradual downshift. The last 4 or 5, it's that dog leg, either up or down, depending on what the measure is, but it's that suddenness that we're monitoring that catches our eye. And, we're not going to, there's no charts in here that are going to show you that Chesterfield economic indicators have followed this same pattern yet, some of which, in fact, we just don't have the data. There's a delay on that. But I think our message today is we have to build a budget that is cautious enough because we don't know where all of this stuff is going, and we have a duty similar. And I mentioned it while the COVID chart is up here. I think that's a very good comparison. Obviously, there's parts of this that are quite different, but in terms of the unknown, sitting in here with the pandemic starting to spread, we had to pivot very quickly to build a budget that could maintain core services, but was also flexible enough to get us through that course of that year. And then our approach was we'd rather come back and add back as opposed to make promises to employees or residents or businesses, whatever the case might be, that we're going to do X, Y, and Z thing and have to pull those promises back. So we'd rather start slow, kind of take a wait and see approach, and then, as you're well aware, you see us on a regular basis, not just in March. So we have the opportunity on a monthly basis to really utilize, I think, the Audit and Finance Committee for regular updates as we get into the fiscal year or even up to the fiscal year to continue to monitor these situations.
And then finally, on this section, just another statistic that follow the wavering consumer sentiment, sorry. Again, that drop-off that you see on the far right, the 64.7 level, you have to go back, aside from about 2011, there was a 10% drop in 1 month. That was largely driven by durable goods that were down about 19%, people holding off on those kind of larger purchases, just given the level of uncertainty in the economy right now. So kind of turning more to the kind of local scene, what you see here is continued unemployment claims. Usually we report out on the initial. The continued is those on a kind of month over month who are still looking for work. The overall trend here, as you can see, especially in the county level, has begun to creep up again. It is data that we are getting every week from the Virginia Employment Commission, and it's something that we're tracking closely, but you can see that beginning to slightly have an uptick. This one's done by the Richmond Fed, kind of over its sector of the couple of states around about us. And this is what's known as the Future Business Conditions Index. Where do businesses see the kind of economic landscape from their perspective over the next few months? And in 1 month, it dropped from a kind of +9, where they had a kind of decently positive view of the economy, down to -30 in 1 month.
So kind of looking at our, drilling this down to some of our revenue trends that affect the budget as we get ready to get into fiscal 26 recommendations. You see here, and this is, we've been saying this for, better part of 2 years. We expect that those large reval results that we received kind of on the very tail end of COVID, 22, 23, that's going to start to normalize. What you're looking here is only through fiscal 25. So we've got another number that we will show when we get to it. But what we're trying to do in this section is just kind of reset everybody kind of where we left off. Another thing that I think doesn't get discussed enough, we've done it a couple times in here the course of this fiscal year, but you have to really take the longer view on this topic. Yes, there have been some larger reval results the last couple of years, but as you see there in the middle of this chart, and we'll say as many times as it takes, 12 consecutive years under 4% reval growth, including the teal bars. There are 5 consecutive years where the actual value of the homes, as determined by the assessor, declined. And then you've got, the better part of a decade where you've got sort of very tepid growth in the 2s and sort of upper 3s. So over time, you see the average there, 4%. We have said consistently that, 3.5 to 4% is the long run average. And then, we'll fast forward to it for a second. The reval activity for this most recent is the 5%. So moving back down towards that long run average. On sales tax, again, this sort of mirrors some of the things you saw on the national level. What the trend is here, no one knows. I think the trend is there is no trend. You see the very, very strong results, a double-digit, really 12 consecutive months of sales tax growth during COVID. People buying durable goods, redoing their houses, a lot of income, being spent on things. People are cooped up, very different pattern of consumer behavior. That has gone all over the map over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. So in terms of forecasting, we've got our biggest economic variable, home values, again, downshifting is sort of that long range average. And then you got sales tax, sort of unpredictable. We've got sort of a very modest forecast there. And then the other big piece for us, of course, is personal property and the tariff environment. That is a very, very difficult thing to forecast what those values will be this time next year. So you've got sort of a murky forecast in terms of local revenues. Again, we don't have the data like we do at the national level per se, but we do know how it impacts our big 3 revenues. And so that all of that factors into this measured approach to the FY26 budget. Yes, sir. Yeah, please jump in anytime.
So, Matt, for the last couple of years, we've seen vehicle valuations go down. Based on what you're saying here, especially when you look at the tariff part of this, it's very possible we may see those vehicle valuations start going back up.
So yeah, so the personal property is a strange one, right? Because just the timing of it. So the valuations that we're setting are set now are for the bills that are due June 5, which is a fiscal 25 issue. What we're charged with in this process is what's that valuation process going to be in 12 months from now. So that's why looking at things like the tariffs and other items is a relevant topic, trying to figure out how that might impact that. We're fairly locked in with FY25, continue to work with the commissioner's office to refine that forecast. It does look like values have dropped again this year, and we'll come back to you all with those recommendations in terms of how to set the relief percentage, so forth and so on. But what we're specifically talking about is trying to look basically 18 months down the road through a lot of challenging geopolitical issues and figure out what that's going to mean. And car values can change, as we all know, very, very quickly.
Sure. Well, I think one of the most hated taxes in Virginia is the personal property tax, and that's the one we hear about the most because of the fluctuation. So a couple of years ago, when they went up quite a bit, we heard a lot about that. Last year, they went down, and we cut the rate, so we didn't hear as much. But if they go up in the next year, we just, I want the community, more so whoever's watching this, to understand that there are other forces that cause these valuations to happen when the Commissioner of Revenue has to turn around and do an assessment on them.
Absolutely. And Dr. Casey talks about living through the cash for clunkers. I mean, all sorts of strange things can happen very, very quickly in that space. So we'll continue to monitor it. The good news for you all is you all have used the relief percentage as a very, very effective tool, which doesn't affect your long-range rate. So you don't have to have that fluctuation. You can have a predictable path for the citizens. But we have gone above the $41 million on a regular basis, since COVID, to provide that temporary relief until prices normalize.
Again, some people may not understand what the $41 million is.
Yeah, I understand. We're going to get into it in a second.
It's probably coming, but they need to understand where that comes from, the origin of it,
Yes,
because it's important.
Yes, sir. Again, looking at some budget trends, I think, none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. FY26 is linked to 25, is linked to, so forth and so on. So this is looking at a period back to 09. You see very, sort of up and down, very modest budget growth up until you get into the COVID period of time. And then the last 2 years, the general fund budget, which is the main operating fund, that's what we focus on. That's what we talk about 99% of the time. Increase of 5%. That's the main operating fund. That's where all of the taxes that we've just discussed fund and flow into. But you see the long run average here, although you got some ups and downs, right around 2%. So this is, again, only up to fiscal 25. This is not the 26 number. We'll tack that on in a second. But I think what's important here, and why we've got that in here, that period of time from the Great Recession through the recovery period, which was very modest for local government, particularly around here, there's a lot of investment that doesn't occur. We built up a lot of things that we were not addressing during that period. The real estate rate was raised 1 penny, Mr. Holland. We'll remember that. It was dedicated to schools. We took it back as soon as conditions, sort of stabilized a little bit. But we ran up a tab on a number of areas where we were not able to invest properly over that 10 to 12 year period. That's really, Mr. Carroll, I know you lived that as an employee, with Dr. Miller the same way. The main way that manifested itself was in terms of pay. So this is looking at the merit history over that period of time. 1.6% was the average merit. Compression was, all over the place. On the teacher side, certainly for first responders, you had a 0 up there. You had 3 consecutive years of 1%. And there's a number of other topics. Certainly infrastructure would be a big one. But all that period of time, it's not as if the budget doesn't grow by 4 or 5%, it doesn't mean that those needs and that those liabilities of sorts go away. They just continue to pile up. And so what happened, then you all had a large part in correcting that. And I'm gonna skip forward to this slide. So what happened? Well, we can go back. So this looks at where does the budget growth, I'll go back one more time. You see 7% merit history, then 3.5, 4, and then back on this slide, you see the larger increases in the general fund budget, 2 years of double-digit growth, really correlate with those higher merit increases. Where was that money spent? Public safety, education, infrastructure, and then this board has made a real targeted effort to reinvest in our tax relief programs broadly. We'll talk about that in just a second. So you have over 80% of the growth of this period where it's larger than normal general fund increases over the last several years. But this is where it went. See support functions down there. That's everybody else that makes the place go. A little over 7%. You know, there were merit increases there, but it was really concentrated in those frontline areas. And to give a little bit more color to it, this is what we were able to accomplish through the budgets over the last 3 to 4 years. And again, you see not only, you know, initiatives that the county should be proud of, but dealing with that backlog of things that happened over that 10-year period. $87 million increase in the transfer to schools, helped establish the teacher pay plans, decompression, a very similar amount into public safety, established the STEP system, which is a guarantee now. You all have gone even beyond that to set up the reserves such that if, you know, economic conditions do change, that 2.25% on July 1 is an absolute something that those folks can count on. $58 million during the height of COVID invested in major maintenance. You heard Bob and Dr. Murray talk about that. That is running out, but we were able to catch up on that backlog and all of the issues that came along with that. Over $500 million into school capacity and school renewal, and that, you know, has done tremendous things to the capacity of the system. We expect, and Josh Davis gave a presentation, you know, earlier in the year, that once all of those facilities are open, and you saw the very, you know, sort of modest growth in enrollment, that system-wide capacity would be somewhere in the mid-80s, you know, after dealing with that issue for, you know, several decades. And then lastly, establishing a new source for transportation. Transportation needs had piled up as well. You had CVTA, and now $427 million into the local road network over the course of the last several years. So yes, the budgets have grown more the last couple of years, but this is what we've done with it. And these are issues that, again, had built up and needed to be addressed over the course of that period of time.
And one of the large components that Matt had talked about was, you know, record levels of tax relief. And just for context, before people draw in on that top left, this is to date. This is not inclusive of the 26 number. This is everything that you have done as a board over the last few years. And you've done it across the full spectrum of relief where possible, not just homeowners, but those that own cars, the businesses, and our seniors and disabled people as well. Real estate tax rate, up till the 2025 budget, down 5 cents, I believe, and it's the largest of all the jurisdictions in Central Virginia in terms of drops over the last 4 or 5 years. Vehicle registration fee went from $40 to $20. That was about an $8 million return of relief to taxpayers every year, with those funds then being dedicated towards the CIP, which is also continuing with the fiscal year 26 budget. As a part of last year's budget, the personal property rate went from 360 to 335, the lowest of all localities in Virginia with a population of 100,000 or more. And then the B-poll thresholds going up from 300 to 500. As Matt had mentioned earlier, those multiple supplements to personal property tax relief when we had those abnormally high values. We increased the threshold on those as well. It was the first adjustment that was always done since 1998. We had in June 2023 the 5% credit on real estate bills. That is going ahead again this June. You voted for that in December. And then a big emphasis, and it's also going to be a part of this budget as well, is expanding eligibility for senior and veteran tax relief. You now have a formal policy in place to adjust those income and net worth thresholds to match Social Security adjustments. You've removed the cap on there as well as increasing the eligible acreage to apply for the program.
Mr. Gerard, I'll come back to your point. The PPTRA, the state gives us $41 million each and every year, and what you all get to do is to figure out how you want to spread that amongst the personal property bills that you have. And there are some exceptions, but generally we spread that $41 million. What you all have decided to do, because we've had these sharp increases that have nothing to do with, you know, anything in Chesterfield County in vehicle values, we have increased that $41 million to $50, $55, $60 million, given depending on the year that you're talking about. So we are deferring that 10, 15, $20 million of revenue and making those bills lower. It's a temporary measure because you got temporary spikes in prices. Now they're coming back down, and we will, have for you over the course of the next couple weeks as we finalize that piece for fiscal 25, what that new relief percentage would be. But that's a very valuable tool, and I think the board has used that well to deal with these, temporary one-time fluctuations. And again, this has been a little bit of a trip
Chair.
down memory lane, but
Matt,
Yeah.
just to, again, you and I know what I'm getting ready to say, but there are some people who are probably watching this that don't know what I'm getting ready to say, which is sometimes why you have to say things, right?
All right.
So when the personal property relief tax program was passed by the state, there was a fixed number for Chesterfield County, and this was what, 98?
Yes, sir.
And that number was $41 million. And the population of Chesterfield County in 98 compared to the population now, which is 394,000 and change, is a huge difference. And that population brings vehicles with them, which means that $41 million gets stretched over a much bigger number on what type of percentage personal property tax relief we can actually calculate on the first $20,000 of value on a personally owned vehicle, not commercial vehicles, not business vehicles, only a commercially owned vehicle. And I think it's important for the community to hear it. Again, we say it every year, but it's important because, again, it's the most hated tax I think, in the state. Because people say, I bought a car, I already paid tax on it, now you tax me again. And what I say is, I understand, but we also need to make sure we have firefighters to come put your car out if it catches on fire. We have rescue people to come save your life if you're getting a crash, and police to investigate if someone steals your car. So, we use those personal property tax dollars to pay for all kinds of things within the county. But to understand that as we've had an increase in people move here with cars, the county's ability to spread that 41 million has been stretched.
Gerard's just sketching here, but I think when it set up for us, we were somewhere in the 70% relief. And now, depending on the year, you're somewhere in the 30 to 35. So it's been cut in half just from what you're saying, the growth, aspect.
And Mr. Chair, to Mr. Carroll's point, this is an example where it's not equitable across the state. Those localities that have grown since the state ran out of its fuel, if you will, to get to 100%, which was their initial desire. They ran out of money at 70%, and I think it was $950 million statewide. I have a tattoo of that because I want to get it removed at some point because they stopped it statewide, and whatever you were getting in that particular year, you were stuck with. We're stuck with, again, a growing, prosperous locality that we cannot provide the same amount of relief to another locality that has not grown since then. There are localities in the state of Virginia that still are at 70%. There's perhaps even localities that have taken this same fixed amount and have granted higher relief than where the state stopped because their tax base of vehicles perhaps is less. That's the fallacy of the formula. I have said for years, if the state wants to stop at $950 million, that's fine, but proportion it out to each and every taxpayer the same way as you had intended it to be when it was at 70%. We could extrapolate this model 50 years from now, and we're going to be, someone sitting to right here will be saying the same exact thing.
But that's okay.
Right, but your successors, I'm sure, will be saying the same thing even more so because there will be localities 50 years from now who will still be at 70%. That's not fair.
Thank you.
All right, so again, I thought the history was important because, again, each budget is not a standalone, not a standalone entity. So now we transition to FY2026, the budget that goes into effect on July the 1st. 2 slides of sort of overall structure. This is the total budget. So this is all in at $2.4 billion. But I do want to just pause here and do some painful accounting discussions. I apologize up front. So it does look like a large increase in the overall budget, but you got to remember 2 things. You had Mr. Hayes and his team in here last month, and the way that this total budget, this is why we will tell you anytime that you want to hear from us, this is not a good measure of the overall budget. because it includes the utility operating fund and the utility CIP. It does not have the county CIP. It does not have the school CIP. That's an accounting rule, essentially, that allows that to happen or requires that to happen. So when you see the utility increase, there are 12 percentage points of the overall increase. Why is that? It's because they got the water treatment facility and these other large projects that we've been planning on for 10 years show up in their particular part of the budget. So that's why, again, it gives you very false reads. The other thing that happens here, as you'll recall, we've been talking about process today. The school increase looks larger because it's going off of the adopted total that you all put into place last April. The state budget didn't come back and be finalized from a revised amount for several months after that. So again, you have a larger increase in the reality in the school fund. The numbers that Dr. Murray walked you through were those revised totals. So they were 4.5% increase. We are right there with them, but that's revised to adopted. It didn't have all the state money. Mr. Engel, you pointed that out very correctly. So again, the better measure, the more accurate measure, the one that people can relate to, the general fund, crest $1 billion, 4.4% increase. Again, last year and the year before, the total increases were 5%. So you see sort of a deceleration in growth heading back towards that long run average. And then the boxes here are where is the total dollars in this budget, how are they invested? Education, public safety, and infrastructure continue to be the big three. Again, support functions, we try to keep that at somewhere around 7% or less, and we continue to do that with this budget. Sort of, the executive summary, the key highlights. This budget is built on continued themes from the last few years. So everything we just showed you about 25 and before, those things really continue into this new chapter. It is built on a 1 cent reduction in the real estate rate from 90 cents to 89 cents. That would mark the fourth consecutive year that the real estate rate would be reduced. It was 95 cents just a handful of years ago. $43 million increase in revenue, 4.4%, 5% last year. So you see that deceleration. 4 net new positions in the general fund in this budget. 4. You have, if you look at the position appendix in the document, which is online, as well as this presentation, all of those materials are up there live. Now, you will see some grant positions come over. We'll talk about that in a second. You'll know what that is. Those are not new people. They're here today. They're just switching funds. But in terms of new bodies that would be here July 1 that aren't here now, in the general fund, it is only 4. By comparison, you remember a couple years ago, we increased fire staffing by 48 just in one department. So we are looking for ways to move the ball forward, to continue to advance strategic initiatives, provide tax relief, but do so in a very, very measured way. Select expenditure choices which allow for that flexibility that we think we'll need given the economic uncertainty. Yes, sir.
I just think it's important to say when you talk about the increase in the firefighters, we were actually paying more money for overtime,
Right.
mandatory overtime for our firefighters to have to work than it was costing us to hire those new firefighters. And so it was desperately needed to bring the new people on because we were overworking our employees. We were killing them.
Again, I think that's one of those things that built up during that 10-year period, not keeping up with staffing levels in critical agencies. Fire would certainly be one of those. We'll get back into this, but 4 positions in here. There are 175 position requests in FY2026 alone that are on the unfunded list, just to kind of give you some sense of the requests we got from departments.
So kind of getting into the details a little bit more about where that $43.8 million increase went. You can see the kind of large buckets on the screen there. Schools, net of the one-time step-down use of reserves that we've implemented over the last couple of years, has a net transfer increase of about 14.2%. In terms of public safety, the 7.2% increase just went into effect in January. The fiscal year 26 budget annualizes that total cost. You can see that on there with the benefits as well, about $17.1 million. There is the merit, same kind of thing, annualization of the merit that went into effect in January here for about $6.8 million. Tax relief for seniors and veterans up by $5 million. We'll go into more of these in depth in a few slides. But long story short, in terms of the expense side, if you take the school transfer increase, the public safety annualisation, and the tax relief programme, that's over 82% of where that $43 million has went. And you can see the source of that on the right. You know, we've talked about this in the past. You've got like kind of three main horses of general fund revenue growth: real estate taxes, personal property, and sales taxes as well. But the other thing that I do want to point out on this slide, and it comes back to that whole flexibility, adaptability, wait and see what happens at the macro level, is that drop in the use of reserves. Typically in a budget cycle, we will have a use of reserves from one-time purchases, nothing ongoing. This budget cycle, we have reduced it on the county side by over $10 million to give us that kind of hedge against what could come down the line, either as a saving measure or if things improve, to be able to be deployed for one-time initiatives.
I won't spend too much time on this. It's a little bit repetitive. They did a great job walking through this, but a 4.5% increase on the school side matches what we did. 3% merit increase. You see a number of the SOQ supports. The ongoing operating costs for Deep Creek Middle, that will be a continued theme over the course of the next few years. And we did whatever we could to try to help them on shared services. There are a variety of, probably the better part of 20 services that we provide in a consolidated fashion, and we have not been passing along the increases to the school division in those to try to, just take a little bit of pressure off of them, and that has allowed them to accomplish a lot of things over the course of the last few years. And as similar as Mr. Durkin just said, reduced reliance on one-time funds in schools as well. They didn't get to zero, but they did reduce by almost $2 million, so they are getting to more of that sustainable place. And again, they have more federal exposure in terms of direct revenue than we do, so that's a very helpful measure for them.
Just to touch on the compensation topic, I'd already talked about. Oh, sorry, sir. Yep.
People understand when we open up a new middle school, which we're getting ready to do, we have to hire teachers, and so that additional cost gets added into the budget.
I'd mentioned about the annualization of the 7.2% increase. Another thing to point out is, there is the continuation of the step plan, the 2.25% that was instituted a few years ago. Again, all of that in is about $17.1 million on an annualized basis, nearly 40% of the overall increase that you see in the general fund budget as part of fiscal year 2026. I will say that for the general government merit of 2.5%, you will see in the news articles as much as anyone, there's other localities that are doing higher than that. We've taken the kind of prudent step right now. We are able to stand behind this number. We never like to be put in the position where we promise a certain percentage and then we have to dial that back. We would rather take the approach of, we can stand up this 2.5 if conditions allow. It's certainly something that we would come back to you all to see if there was a recommendation for adjustment.
And we do have luxury on that piece. We moved, as you remember, moved the merit date for general government to January 1st. So that gives us some inherent flexibility to 2.5 could, go back to the 3, which was what was in the 5-year plan. But again, just that 50 basis points gives us a little bit of breathing room right out of the gate. Tax relief, again, continued priority here. You see 89 cents, the 4 consecutive declines there. The rate's been reduced, basically 1 out of every 3 years, going back over the last 30 years, starting back at $1.09. So that pattern has really just gone one direction. We sort of, looking at the rate itself is a little bit hard to, sort of personalize or really kind of wrap your head around. So we tried to put an example in here. I think that does a better job of kind of explaining what this has looked like over time. So this scenario looks at a house that has a value of $250,000 in 2008. The increase in terms of real increase, if you take that house and they're following the average reassessment for the county. Everyone in here is going to be high or low amongst that average, but that's how we constructed this. So the county average over this entire period, that bill would increase $872 from 08 to 2025. On an annual basis, that's a little over $50 a year, or 1.9% increase over that period. From 24, last tax year to this tax year, it's a $43 increase, a 1.3%. And to get that, it's the benefit of, well, first off, you've got the assessment activity, so it's 5% on an average house year over year. That's Mr. Bloomfield's part of the equation. And what we're recommending today is going from 90 to 89, and the board has already set aside, and the treasurer has, as recently as today, working on those simulations through the tax system, a 5% credit on the first half of the tax bill. So it's a one-time 5% on the first half, or you could look at it as a 2.5% credit over the course of the tax year. You take the one-time credit, and the 1 penny reduction gives you, on average, an increase of 1.3% year over year tax year for this house. So I think the other thing I want to point out, and you kind of have to stare hard, but you see a red dashed line here, and you see how many years it takes to get back. You're all the way back to 2020 before you're paying more, just in nominal terms. There's no adjustment for inflation or anything like that. The amount you're paying in 2008, you got to go all the way out to 2020 before you're paying more than you did in 2008 because of the reductions in home values and then the very sort of that period of very weak growth. So again, taking the longer view, the last few years we have seen larger assessment increases, but if you look at this whole period of time through a couple of economic cycles, the average increase on a year-over-year basis less than 2%, and it's $50 a year over the full period. Yes, ma'am.
Just to be clear, the line over here is yellow. Over here, it looks maybe orangish yellow. I was just wanting to make sure people were clear on that.
Gerard and I said to each other, we were sitting there, that we needed to go see the optometrist very soon, so I think we're going to speed that up. The dashed line, yes, ma'am. Well, now it does look orange to me. So we took that one step further, same scenario, and instead of using what has actually happened to the average home value, we said, okay, well, it's going to be 3% a year over this time period. 2008, your home appreciates by 3% a year. That entire period of time, the difference in those tax bills in total is over $12,000 if it's an average 3% increase versus what has actually happened over that period of time. So, it gets bandied about that, 3% is a target, but when you actually sit down and you do the math and you look at it, it doesn't necessarily come out the way you would think. This has been an absolute priority for the board in terms of tax relief. I want to point out a couple of things. This is a combined program, so it does have the disabled veteran piece, which was a state mandate, unfunded mandate, certainly a program that we support, but it is a costly part of this program. They're all in here together. It's one cost center. So just want to make sure that is that's pointed out. What you all have control over, though, you don't have any control over what happens with the disabled veterans. You do on the elderly and the disabled. The board put in place that automatic Social Security adjustment increase. That has increased those thresholds in the program by over 22% over the last couple of years. That remains in place. That's an automatic thing. It doesn't even have to come back to an agenda. But what we are recommending for this plan, given the level of uncertainty, is investing $5 million into this program such that allows for us to deal with program participant growth. We have more 65 and older folks that might be eligible. That's just sort of the natural order of things, as well as we can see what happens with the overall economy. We can see what happens with prices. So if you want to go above the Social Security piece, which is automatic, you have the resources already built in this budget. So a $5 million increase for the direct benefit of the senior program. You don't have to have this determined by April 9. You've got all the way, probably I would tell you sometime into August or September in order to give the commissioner's office enough time to take that decision and make sure that she can advertise and the forms and all of those things. But you've got at least through the summer to make this determination. But this budget does include a large increase in the program to make sure we are paying attention to the needs of those folks.
again, just for ease for the public to understand, we have to recognize through Virginia accounting practices that this is an expense of the county. So we gross up our real property tax revenues for what we bill out as far as a gross. For those that qualify for relief, we kind of net the bill, but the net is actually shown up as an expense. So the two go together in netting out the tax bill. But some people would be confused. We're not actually writing checks per se as an expense like we do for other expenses, but through accounting practices that are mandated by the state, we all have to gross up both sides of the transaction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Casey, for that. I wanted to go back and look at the growth in this program because many
yes,
years
sir.
ago, we tried to mitigate that. As you may recall, Jared, one board I served on, we looked at that because we saw it back in, I think, 2008 or 9. We were looking at $3 or $4 million, and now we're at $24.2 million. Again, unfunded by the state for the veterans as well. As you point out, we get nothing from the federal government or the state government to help mitigate that significant increase. And also, I'm sure you can see the age wave as well in that number and the growth in population in Chesterfield as well. So just want to point out that big increase, that number is pretty staggering to me in terms of increase from my perspective.
And with the help of the Commissioner's Office, we've run a number of scenarios, and so I think our thought process, get into, July, bring that maybe to audit and finance, share what those numbers look like, and then we could bring that to the full board to have it, adopted in time for the fall.
Yeah, I'm glad to see this. This is I've had many conversations with you and Jennifer. I just think that it's there's a lot of citizens that if they have two people living in the house that are only on limited Social Security income, the $64,000 that we have right now as the threshold doesn't always cover them. And so I just think that maybe we could look at increasing that somehow to a little higher threshold so that they would be qualified for some kind of relief. So.
Mr. Chair, I don't disagree with that, except that, what we did, and it may require an adjustment. We removed the cap, right? So anybody who does fall into the threshold, they get a 100% reduction, depending on where they fit, right? It might be 60, whatever the number may be. Other jurisdictions have higher numbers, but they don't have they have a cap. So you're changing it, and if you do that, and you're taking away that greater benefit for the people who make even less, and so there's a trade-off there.
Mr.
I was, again, I think that Jennifer and I have talked about, there might be about shifting those scale numbers that she has, because it depends on what percentage of relief they get, depending on how high. And so might just need to, even if the higher number, if we raise the number a little higher, they would get a smaller percentage of discount. I just think that there's a good way of trying to get, yes.
Mr.
Hold on one second. To Mr. Holland's point, just looking at that chart, I like to look at FY22, which is when Mr. Holland and Mr. Carroll and I worked together to make the first significant increase in many years in that. And then if you look at the chart from there to what we're proposing this year, this full board, all five of us are working together to continue that effort, because we recognize that our fastest growing population is our 55 plus, our seniors in the county, and that we do have a lot of seniors that fall into a position where they are struggling with the increased taxes. So I just wanted to point out that originally it was the three of us, and now continued all five of us to make this program more robust to take care of those citizens that we know are precious to us and have been here for a long time. So thank you to this whole board for helping us to do that.
So just a couple of other points, and I think this is a very worthwhile topic, actually, to come back and drill down like we have done in the past to set up for the next calendar year, because what you see before you is the 2025 year. But as part of the demographics of these populations, it is important to note those that are renting do not get this break regardless of their disposition. And so every dollar that we're increasing on this relief, all things being equal, we are shifting the burden to those that are not eligible for the program, even shifting the burden to those who might be renting where their rents are going up because, again, their taxes are going up. So I just think we have to be mindful of this, but I also do think, to the board's credit, these automatic adjustments are very similar to how we're framing the business license taxes. If we defined you once as small business and you're growing by an inflationary rate, as a good business should at minimum grow, then we will still call you a small business and raise the thresholds. You, by default, are recognizing there are people whose incomes may grow by an inflationary manner, Social Security as an example. You're not going to grow out of this program because of Social Security changes.
The last note on sort of the tax relief chapter is the B poll. You all have had a similar practice with the seniors to increase that threshold by not specifically a inflationary target, but we are recommending go from a 500 where it is currently to 550. Same concept. Somebody whose bottom line has just been impacted by the cost of goods, we don't want them to then move out of that $10 scenario that they're currently in. Dr. Miller, did you have something to add?
Just a comment on how we take good care of each other. And by that I mean how we as a community take care of our elderly or disabled and our veterans. And the way that we do that is that, I think I'm right in, tell me if I'm wrong, that for every penny we're talking $6 or $7 million. Is that accurate? So if we're talking $24 million, then we're saying that we're paying an additional 3 cents on our taxes on average per 100 to take care of our community. And I think that's so important for folks to understand. But that's what it's about. Is that by taking care of our elderly or disabled and our veterans, we're doing the right thing.
So just some other things that are in the fiscal year 2026 proposed budget. You can see on the top left, the growth in contractual obligations. This is something that we have every single year as contracts come up for renewal. The big one in here, it was already part of the plan, the 5-year plan from last year's budget, is the ongoing costs of the new financial system. Just as a quick reminder, the system that it will be replacing was first instituted in 2008, so well beyond its useful life. Moving on to the new initiatives, it's about $1.9 million. That's about 4% of the growth in the general fund that you'll see between 25 and 26. So a very limited number, both in terms of absolute dollars and initiatives that we are putting in. You'll see on there some highlights: funding for parks and recreation, some funding adjustments for their part-time to be able to stand up staffing all of the events happening around the park system. You will see some deputy and personnel enhancements in the Sheriff's Office. I've worked closely with Sheriff Leonard on that over the last year or so to rectify those kind of imbalances within part-time positions in his office. And finally, in that one, you'll see the Employee Medical Centre. That was something that was stood up as part of last year's budget. That actually, in the longer term, will help reduce our healthcare costs that we have with the healthcare fund, as our employees and skills employees are able to utilise that service in-house as opposed to going to more costly options outside of the Employee Medical Centre. And then finally, you'll see on here on the far right in the kind of lavender box, existing and cost-neutral initiatives. The ARPA programme, Matt had referenced earlier when we were talking about the FTE count, those 12 positions moving over from the ARPA fund to the general fund. That will now become a permanent programme as part of the general fund operations. And then you can see on here for kind of zero net costs, some position regrades in social services that will be funded basically through state and federal funds. And then the streetscapes in Midlothian Turnpike, which is not going to receive any general fund contributions because there's a restricted revenue source that they pay into for that as well.
The more important message on really the right-hand side is those requests come in as grossed up, and then the budget staff, which is sitting in here this afternoon, they work hard with those departments to look for, a department that's got some surplus budget, maybe they've got a savings somewhere else. So how can they help themselves to move these initiatives forward? So everything on that right side, you get all of those items for $800,000 essentially. That's because they're going through line item by line item in those budgets, trying to figure out how we can just reallocate within a department to a new initiative to let them get these things done. So this kind of thing happens every year. And the new initiatives, see, if you think back to AFR totals the last several years, you're going to see numbers much, much higher than 1.9 million. That kind of goes to that, being very select with what we have put forward. And a number of these are just like the clerk position, for example. Those are part-time today and then converting them to full-time. So trying to, again, utilize staff that are already here, maybe get a little more hours out of them, but trying that before just adding new positions.
So, we've talked a lot about inflation today, and we've talked about this chart in particular before as well. On a nominal level, inflation can really distort the cost of goods and services. So we like to look at, what is the cost of operating the county once you strip out inflation? And what you can see here is, that green line is back to the fiscal year 2012 level, where it's about $1,800, give or take, per capita to operate the county as a whole. You can see we've stayed right around that level, kind of bobbed up and down in the last couple of years. Actually, compared to last year's budget, there has been a slight dip. You will see it going from 1793 to 1780. So even with all of these investments that you've made over the last few years, on a real basis, once you strip out inflation, the true cost of running things day to day has actually been on par with levels that we saw back in 2012. So one thing we thought we'd highlight as part of this budget is kind of, ongoing savings and efficiencies. And if I can be quite, some candor for a second, it's really not something that we've done a great job of telling, because it's just something that's so core to what we do every day. But it is something we should do a better job of saying to the public out loud, is we go through these budgets every year to identify where savings and efficiencies can be found before we come back and ask for additional dollars from taxpayers. And you can see from this chart, this is not everything, this is not a comprehensive list, but it does run across the full services of county operations, all the way from the employee medical centre, saving in-house costs of over $300,000 last year, to our purchasing and e-payables programme. If I remember correctly, you had them as everyday excellence about a year or two ago. Since 2012, that has returned over $4 million back to the county. You see with utility costs, we've been installing solar panels across county and school buildings over the last few years. Fiscal year 2024, that saved nearly $300,000 a year. Fuel conversion from gas to liquid propane, same thing. Fleet policy, only first responders are allowed to take their vehicles to home each night. The fleet review is annual to see justification about whether vehicles are needed as well. And then finally, kind of reduction in administrative footage needs. So a picture we probably should have put on here, but just even down the hall with our internal audit office, and what previously was one office occupied by one person is now pretty much entirely occupied by that entire department. So if we can find an efficiency and squeeze an efficiency, we will find it. To that point, as Matt said, all the budget team are here and they've done a fantastic job throughout this process. We were able to find over $7.2 million worth of efficiencies as part of this budget. That runs the gamut from one-time costs that were in fiscal year 2025 budget, procurement and economic development have implemented new strategies in their personnel structure. They were able to give up positions as part of this budget. And then, it might sound strange, but it is actually very, very true. We go through every single line item, line by line, with a ruler to find where we can find efficiencies and savings within department budgets. And that exercise alone saved about $1.3 million that has been able to reinvested into things like contractual increases that the departments are seeing this year as well.
I think while we mentioned it a second ago, but this row here, like maybe the other one's left, but we do have the bulk of our budget. There's Coleman back there, and Sheila. They've done a fantastic job putting this plan together. So just wanted to take a moment and thank them and tie into what we've just been talking about here. When I joined the budget office in FY2026, had 14 people in that office. They run that same shop today, much larger budget, much more complex budget with 9 people. So, that's the kind of thing that happens over time, trying to find ways to leverage technology. This group is very, very savvy in that, but that has allowed them to take a core function and it takes 5 positions that have been able to disperse elsewhere in the organization to do other, more public-facing things. So thank you guys very much for all your hard work.
So as we referenced earlier, as part of this budget, we have made some very limited strategic investments until we can have a better idea of what we are going to see at the macro level. But there are many unfunded requests as part of this budget. On the operating side, there was $22.1 million worth of requests that we were not able to fund. It was about 175 full-time positions. On the capital side, that was a little over $300 million worth of capital projects that we were not able to invest dollars in. And then transportation, as much as investments we've put in the last few years, there is still an outstanding need of about $4.5 billion worth of transportation projects that you will not see as part of this budget.
Mr. Chair, as you know, Dr. Murray referenced the JLOC report, so the schools have used that and us together as an effective tool for communicating out the $200 million plus shortfall of the state to possibly deal with unfunded. This is not necessarily something that there's a JLOC report on this, but as you can tell from various presentations of the ways in which the state does have many powers, even on the local government side. And, I will give the state credit. Annually, the Commission on Local Government produces a report on mandates of state to local. Many of which are regulatory, and many of which are not necessarily fully funded. That's a product available to the public as well. And just as we're communicating out the JLARC report to those that are of interest to maybe advocate on our behalf, citizens and otherwise, which is in their interest from a tax burden, that this unfunded mandates report may also be another product worthy of the citizens' review.
Next topic is something that was brought up by a number of board members. Kind of what is the county's exposure to direct exposure to some of these federal topics? And there have been stops and starts here where, grants have been cut on, cut off. So we pulled this together just to kind of give you a sense. On the general fund side, and Gerard mentioned it earlier, almost the entirety of our direct federal revenue on an annual ongoing basis is in social services. Those are, pass-through items that come through the general fund. We hope we don't see any disruptions there. If you look on the right-hand side, we went back and looked for the last full audited year, what were those major categories, regardless, county schools, didn't matter. But I think we're, happy to have this list. I'm gonna walk you through real fast. So ESSER, that was one-time money that went into the school division. You just saw the school budget. There's very little that they did with ESSER that rolled into an annual operating budget. So I think they're to be commended for that. The next one is same program on our side, some of the ARPA and CARES money, same thing. The only thing that really, passes that test in terms of an ongoing piece is those 2 initiatives in the fire department. Gerard just talked about those. Those are being picked up on an annual basis. The rest of it was one-time pieces. So the message is we do have federal money that flows through here, but by and large, we try to use it for one-time things such that if those spigots were cut off moving forward, it has less of an impact in terms of personnel and, sort of day-to-day costs. We try as best we can to put as much of this into capital and one-time pieces of the budget. That's what I mentioned just here. The ARPA piece, we just wrapped this up in December. You all held the public hearing. The only 2 pieces that have an ongoing here are the mobile integrated health, the peak demand. The biggest, of course, was $25 million into AM Davis. So, no limited or no exposure there for us. Those dollars are already spent. That school is scheduled to open this fall. Even more broadly than that, we looked at sort of overall employment trends. Less than 2.5% of Chesterfield County employees are recognized as federal. At the state level, that's about 2x. Of course, that doesn't take into account the contractors and other folks in Northern Virginia. But in terms of direct flows of money, we think we have a limited exposure. In terms of disruptions in the county workforce, fairly limited exposure. I think our concern on the federal topic, beyond just the uncertainty that has been created, is really the impacts in Northern Virginia. If you've read anything about those budgets, those locality budgets up there, they are really bracing for some much deeper cuts. Obviously, that doesn't have a direct impact for us, but that flows into the state budget. It is an economic engine for the Commonwealth, and we can see reductions, particularly on the school side. They've done that the last couple of years, state sales tax. So it's kind of those secondary pieces that we'll continue to watch. But in terms of direct impact to Chesterfield on the federal piece, we feel like we're in a pretty good place.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Go back to the previous slide, if you could. I have a question, just so I have clarity on it. 2.4% of all employed individuals in the county. We talk about people that are working in the county, and let me just kind of lay my cards on the table. I'm wondering about those individuals that live in the county but are working at Fort Greg Adams. Is that being counted as part of this?
I believe this is it would be picked up in this. This should be more of a household survey.
Okay.
They would be part of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Including some that were working remote.
That's right.
Just as an FYI, the Weldon Cooper Center just issued a report, I believe, last night that I forwarded to you. It's a public report as a PDF that shows the entire state workforce, as Mr. Harris illustrated here. But more importantly, it shows by locality the concentration of that workforce. Chesterfield County is in the second highest tier, that we are 6 to 9% of the federal workforce. There are localities, many localities, Northern Virginia, the Prince George, as an example, would be a much higher percentage of their population, greater than 9%, but we are classified 6 to 9%. I also rationalize those federal workers have discretion of where they choose to live in the region. We have a high quality of life, have a great school system. Many of the Fort Greg Adams, leadership, if you will, resides in Chesterfield County.
I guess my bigger concern is not the direct impacts, but the rolling down impacts of, getting rid of SNAP if SNAP funds go away, or Medicaid or Medicare. Those are our citizens that are going to lose those benefits, and what are we going to do to help them? So I guess I just really, I understand that's not, we're not obliged to do that, but we are here to serve our citizens, and so that's what I worry about. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind.
No, I mean, certainly the spirit of what you're discussing is the spirit in which we built the budget. I don't know, we don't have a direct response or reaction that we can deal with that, but we recognize that, again, our what we're hedging against is the broader uncertainty. I think this is something we'll continue to update the board on. We'll follow up on the question about the survey, but it is information that we will continue to provide you. You want that one?
Yeah. So moving on to the CIP, I hope you all can see that dot on the left. If they say that a picture speaks, if they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, this one speaks 105,610. We have heard a lot over the last few months about the county and its debt and trying to understand that. Our debt position is something that we take extremely seriously, as you can see on that chart. We do not have the luxury of the federal government to borrow. We have to have a balanced budget, as Dr. Casey referenced this morning at the media briefing. And if you look at the per capita debt position for the county, it's a little shade under $3,000 a person. You take that and extrapolate it to the national level with the national debt, you're in six figures, nearly $106,000. And what I will point out before I move on is that our number may grow or even go down in a given year. That 105,610 will be a lot higher next year.
Real quick, though, you said we don't have the ability to borrow. We do have the ability to borrow.
To fund,
we do not
right.
have the ability to go into debt to borrow.
Yes.
That the federal government
Yes.
has. But
Yes.
we do, through
Yes.
bonds,
Yes.
that we pay back in a timely
Yes.
manner.
Yes.
We do have the ability to borrow. We just don't borrow more than we can pay back because, fortunately, state law prohibits that, which is good. I'm glad that that does. But
Not for
the federal
day-to-day.
government can borrow into affinity, and that's the problem.
And they can borrow on the operating side, which I think that's really what Gerard is
Yeah.
referencing. We do not have, that's not something that we do. We only borrow for assets.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I could just highlight this too, that dot that we have is constrained because we're AAA. There are localities that may have a higher debt per capita, that may even have balanced budgets, that have a larger percentage of their budget going towards debt, or larger percentages of burden to their people. You don't keep the AAA status. As Mr. Harris was a young child back then, but during that recessionary period, The rating agencies were actually on the verge of lowering the federal government's, what they call their sovereign AAA rating, because they were at the federal government paying back its debt. I was with Hanover at the time. I got together with my friends in Henrico and Chesterfield, and we all made a statement with our AAA bond rating because they were going to bring our bond ratings down because of the federal government. We took the position we can pay our money back, and we do not punish us because our parent or grandparent cannot pay their debt. And the rating agencies listened. Fortunately, the United States, as a congressional and president at the time, listened as well and tried to get their house in somewhat order. But the $105,000, I can't point to assets across the country that represent the financing of that. I can point to the Hoover Dam, but I think even that debt has been paid off.
Can I add to that the interest on the debt, which is outstripped Medicare as well? It went over last year. So that's interesting. Got to pay interest and debt.
And
So very good point. While I'm here, one question, two questions if I may very briefly. One is, you mentioned the operating system from 2008 that's being replaced. Is that the accounting system?
Yes, sir.
That's what we're replacing, okay.
It's a consolidated system, county and schools.
Okay, integrated as well?
Yes, sir.
And we have more integration, which is wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank
It's
you.
a
Great.
very good
And on
system.
I saw earlier where we did not use any debt reserves, any reserve cash.
That's right.
And we're at the point where we're funding that amount that we have set, the limit we've set, we're funding that. Have we fully funded that yet, or are we still in progress?
No, I know that's a passion of yours, Mr. Hahn. We are in year 2
Okay.
over this 4-year term, so that we're
Okay.
getting up to the 10%. So
Good, very good.
Yep, making another step with this plan. So that's just another safeguard that we've got in place to make sure that we can continue, core services.
Thank you.
And then the final thing I'll say about the national debt scene, and then I promise to get off my soapbox, is, when the federal government was downgraded about 14 or so years ago, if you actually look at the credit reports for the county every time we go to the market, and one of them in particular, you will see that they rate us higher than the sovereign debt, because in their eyes, on a rating agency perspective, we have a better control over our fiscal house than the national government does.
So next 2 slides kind of take this conversation more to Dr. Casey's point. How do we stack up against our direct peers, not the federal government? So this is looking at debt service per capita amongst our peer group. You see 247. So second lowest amongst our peer group. This is APA data that they publish on an annual basis. Looking at debt service as a percent of your total revenue, as to Mr. Holland's point, you got to pay that interest and the principal. So that has us at 5.8%. Again, towards the lower end of our peer group, a very manageable position. And then this is the full matrix of the full debt policies that govern everything that you do anytime that we want to borrow. It doesn't matter what avenue you borrow it through, whether it could be, VPSA, it could be GO, it doesn't matter. This is the rule book that's in place that makes sure we stay in a good position. And you can see the arrows, the first 3 all going down from fiscal 23 to fiscal 24, meaning that in aggregate, we have a lower debt position than we did the year before. We're trying not to go over 2.5% debt as a percent of AV. We're at 1.1. Debt to personal income, not to go over 5%. We're at 2.97. And then the last one, I always try to point this out. Our goal, that is, if we didn't issue another penny of debt today, that within 10 years, we'd have 65% of all of our debt paid off, and we're almost to 70% on that mark. So, yes, we have done a lot of infrastructure projects. Think about all the things that you all have cut ribbons on and put shovels in the ground. We're able to do all of those things and still have a very, very carefully managed debt position. This really is, above all else, this is the core of a AAA locality. So looking at the CIP, again, this is a 5-year plan. Move through these pretty quickly. This is all the sources, and all I really want you to know about this slide is what's on this slide here. It is 2/3 cash, 1/3 debt. So yes, we have a referendum that we're underway with county and schools, but we are predominant cash operation when it comes to putting infrastructure in the ground here, and that prevents us from having, or allows us to have, that tiny dot instead of the big one. Looking at that same concept in a little different way, this is the blue sort of figure you see. That's current debt service. That's that fall off. So if in 10 years, do we have 70% of that paid off? That's our goal. What you see in the teal on top of that is everything else that we expect to sell. And you can see, because of the way we structure the debt, that it barely goes over that yellow or orange line, I'm not sure, but it barely crests that over that full period of time. So we're able to finish out the referendum and still, not see a shock in debt service payments that would crowd out our ability to offer other programs and services or pursue, further tax relief measures. How's the money being used? Community infrastructure, that's a glossy thing that Coleman came up with. That means roads, essentially. Major maintenance being the next biggest piece of that. That's vitally important. That is taking care of everything we already have on the ground here. And then you see the other navy box up in the corner, referendum projects. Again, this is just the county side over the full 5 years. So where are these projects going to go? They're going to go into roads, they're going to do major maintenance, and they're going to be the execution of the 22 referendum. Speaking of which, approved in November of 22. Again, we are taking a step back here. We are not issuing debt or plan to in this upcoming fiscal year. 2 reasons for that. One of which is it's a nice safeguard. Again, that's less pressure on the budget. But you see that middle block here, the pipeline is quite full. We approved in November of 22. We were out selling in the marketplace by May. So we jump-started that, and we are still fully within the legal timeline to get all of these projects done. So even though we are not selling debt, we're to remind everybody that full middle block is underway. Take a little different look at that. Mr. Bowles and his team have a full plate. You see all those projects, what phase they're in, and then the timeline. Again, all of this is included in the packet that's up on the website, so we'll be able to update folks on this. In the transportation space, again, a big chunk of your 5-year revenue sharing comes back. You have $23 million just in fiscal 26. There's more state dollars there. So remember, this is the program where you put $1 in, the state matches you. That's almost up to a $24 million package for FY26. You see a heavy emphasis in here on safety projects. A number of roundabouts, the Dundas Road improvements, focusing on pedestrian safety, so a heavy emphasis there is part of this plan. There is a 1-year holiday from community connectivity. That's what we call our sidewalk program. The only reason for that, we had that opportunity with the revenue sharing to move those dollars into there, so we're able to double what that community connectivity buys us by doing it through a different program. It is restored in full by the time we get to fiscal 27. A couple other highlights that I'll touch on. The airport enhancements. The big thing here is the extension of the runway, which will be complete over this 5-year period. The Chesapeake Bay TMDL, this is our heavy environmental focus to make sure that we are sending clean water down to the TMDL, down to the bay rather, $24 million over that 5-year period of time. This is funded by that separate fee. We collect it every year. It's a little higher in this because we collect it and then spend it as that team is ready to put projects on the ground. And then technology continue to be an even mix of replacing things like the Chromebook, the tough books that our first responders use, and then a continued emphasis on cybersecurity to make sure that we are protected on that front. Dive down into major maintenance for a second. As you can see, this cuts across the board. I won't, go into each one of these pieces of the pie, but we are making sure we are taking care of all of our existing assets. We had that policy, 2.5% of the replacement value reinvested every year. We are fully in compliance with that, with this plan. The big emphasis this year, though, is on HVAC. You see some projects, some systems that are coming close to the end of life. So we've identified with Mr. Bowles and his team over $20 million of HVAC needs over this period of time. We are looking at other ways to pay for that. at least in the short run. Otherwise, $20 million out of that major maintenance program is going to crowd out everything else that's going in there. So we'll come back to you, just planting a seed, probably sometime in the summer to figure out how we can line of credit or some other vehicle to be able to go ahead and attack that. The other thing that we don't want to do is stretch these projects out over a number of years. It becomes more costly and it's interrupt the operations in all of those buildings. This is a new topic in the CIP, so we'll pause here for a second. I think you're familiar with the James River tennis courts, but we did go through a very specific evaluation of all the facilities on school grounds. So we're not talking about the buildings, but trying to do a facility condition assessment of everything outside of the building. The first part of that was looking at tennis courts. So this budget includes $4.2 million to deal with all of the identified tennis court major maintenance needs. Half of that would be in 26, and the 3 facilities that have been identified for funding in 26 are James River, Thomasdale, and Matoaka. Another element of that would be turf field replacement to continue that program. That sits in 27 and 28, and there's other elements of that facility condition assessment that we will bring to you in outer years. So those are the specific projects, but I think my bigger message here is this is something we were looking to add to our overall major maintenance program, taking care of those facilities, because while they're on school grounds, they certainly benefit the broader community. It's used by far outside of just the people that go to the school. And then similarly, a new line item in the park space, really focused on upgrading existing facilities. We've had a lot of success with this. Rockwood's getting ready to turn 50. It hasn't had a facelift. So not expanding the park system under Mr. Luther's leadership, but really let's go in. We've got great parks and great spots. Let's make sure that they are shiny and look like a facility that the community wants to go and visit. Rockwood is one of our most visited parks, so they would receive those upgrades for their 50th birthday. You saw this earlier. This gets into a little more granularity in terms of the unfunded projects in the CIP. This is a $300 million list. We'll have to come back to a lot of these. We won't spend a lot of time on it today, but that's the major parts of it. The second part of the POIT, looking at the courts building, will be another topic, more roundabouts, so forth and so on. But we do have a laundry list of CIP projects. The main thing we put this in here for is if we have the opportunity to come back to any of these things and accelerate, we feel like it is important to disclose that to the public. So they know that there was a plan, and all we're doing is moving something up the matrix. Last chapter, and to be very brief, sort of looking ahead, and I think this ties in well with how schools ended their presentation. This is overall county population growth, and you can see that average over the last number of years, right around 1.5%, and we have decelerated right to that for the last 2 years. So population growth overall in a manageable place, but I think as has been pointed out many times here today, it's not necessarily the top line number that's interesting, but it's the dynamics within that, and particularly the 65 and older. So making sure whether it be tax relief or programming for them, that's going to be a continued topic as we move forward. You see the expected growth or the growth since 2009 in that demographic. That's going to be something that will be with us for many budgets to come. Same story in student growth. They did a nice job of this. You see that flattens out. That has put us in a great position in terms of capacity of our buildings, but absolutely I would agree with both of the gentlemen that were up here before us. Major maintenance is going to be a big topic in fiscal 27. So any opportunity we have with schools surpluses or even on the county side, trying to make a run at that major maintenance issue, that debt issue that you all authorized several years ago is about to be all spent out. They got a base of about $10 million, but they need to fill in that other space anywhere from $10 to $20 million. Won't happen in 1 year, but it is going to be a topic we'll come back to. And then lastly, that sort of normalized revenue environment. These are our out-year forecasts for residential reval. You see the 5.1% this year, but we do expect that to sort of moderate over the course of the 5 years. To being conservative, but I think that we're not going back to those double-digit increases, so we're going to have to continue to be very selective in terms of the initiatives that we push forward. what's immediately ahead, there's your list of all of your community meetings, which start tomorrow night at Manchester Middle School. The 26th is your public hearing downstairs, adoption on the 9th, and then the most important words on here, additional budget updates. You're going to adopt the budget on April 9th, but this topic is going to be with us. I think it's going to extend well beyond that. We need to monitor economic conditions and bring updates back to the board, or certainly audit and finance, into the summer, fall, as long as it takes. So April 9th's a big date. It certainly has some weight to it, but I think this is going to be a longer season than normal. So with that, we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Board members, any other questions? Thank you for your presentation.
You're going to say what I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you to the whole department for all of your work on this. I know it's a year-long job that you start again tomorrow. Well, actually, you're not finished yet, but then you'll start again the next day. So thank you for all your work on this.